Welcome to PetroNoia, the podcast that cuts through the noise of the energy debate. Hosted by Dan Ramito, this show takes complex energy issues, strips away the agendas, and delivers clear fact-based insights. Whether you're an industry expert or simply looking for a balanced perspective, PetroNoia brings clarity to the conversation. Each episode, Dan breaks down key topics, from U.S. energy independence to global policy impacts, focusing on the facts rather than the rhetoric, helping listeners make sense of the energy landscape. This is PetroNoia, where we separate fact from fiction to fuel-informed discussions.
Welcome to PetroNoia. I'm your host, Dan Ramito. I'm thrilled to have my guest, Bob Smith, today. He's the CEO of Sage Advisory. I'll let him get into the mix, but wait till you guys hear what he has to say about decarbonization, China, net zero, sustainability. Bob, thank you so much for coming on. Before we dive right in, I love getting a background of every guest. So just, it can be 5 minutes, it can be 20 minutes, just the point we're at now. How did you get here?
Sure. Dan's very nice to be with you. And the road here has been different. I started the investment management business many years ago and started Sage Advisory just about 30 years ago. And when we first started out, I was investing in the traditional way, and we had clients from all over the country. And then this notion of SRI, socially responsible investing, was coming to us more frequently in the sense of clients wanting us to really focus on socially responsible issues and the formation of their strategies. And I said, they're pretty interesting. I'd say that was about 2003, 2004.
Okay.
And this is coming from a guy that used to be an advisor to the Central Bank of Saudi Arabia and lived in Riyadh for 6 years. I was all about oil. I was all about the petrochemical industry. So I never really had thought about it until the SRI inquiries started to come in.
And who were making those inquiries?
They were institutional clients. They could be endowments, foundations, high net worth individuals, things of that nature. People who had that kind of embedded in the way they looked at the world. And so in order to take advantage of it, in the sense of, okay, I can provide a service, we really had to learn, the whole process. And what we found very quickly in 2003 and 4 is that there was a huge scattering of information. It wasn't very well organized. There wasn't really what we would call a framework in terms of how to really tackle this. It was very values-based, not really science-based. So what we wanted to do was to really move in the direction of a more science-based, more quantitatively based, more data-based kind of orientation, so that we as good fiduciaries could deliver what we promised and make sure that it was fiduciarily sound. And then over the course of time, as you well know, the whole world of ESG kind of emerged, everything from the SRI world. And there were a number of issues why, the UN, Kofi Annan, his leadership and so forth, and then the formation of, the principles and the SDGs, the Social Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals, were all drivers to kind of push people into this thinking of ESG.
Yep.
And environmental, social, and governance issues. We always thought about them, but we never thought about them in the context of risk management.
Right.
And I think that's where the transition came at about 2013, 14, 15. Things really started to get going that allowed us to really progress into more of an ESG-focused framework for the benefit of our clients. And in doing so, we learned a lot. And in doing so, we also created our own proprietary kind of assessment system framework, what we call our LEAF score, which really guided us. And today, we're evaluating roughly 1,500 or more companies every single day as to whether or not we feel that they have very strong environmental sensitivity and consciousness and intentionality, whether they are socially connected in the sense of their consumers, their communities, their human capital. And then lastly, how well governed are these people?
Right.
Everybody assumes I have a wonderfully governed company.
Right.
And the fact of the matter is that ain't true.
Right.
And so what principles, what requirements, what standards should you have that should be utilized in the assessment of what constitutes good governance? Because if you're going to be sustainably focused, if you're going to be socially sensitive, that is not something that you're naturally wired for.
Right.
Nobody is accidentally, sustainable.
Mhm.
You have to work towards it.
Like you just fell into being
Exactly. And so, we wanted to make sure that in the process of figuring out whether or not somebody was managing their natural resource uptake reasonably, whether they had good relations with the human capital, we also wanted to know what was the intention of the management.
Right.
And how are they driving that process? Because for us, the G is the whole thing.
Right.
And so we overweight that in all of our scores. We make sure that we look at peer group analysis. We look at industries individually as they should be, one against the other, and so forth. But the important thing that we wanted to know in all of this is how to know if we were moving in the right direction. So we compared every company in terms of what they were in the past to where they are today.
Okay.
What the guy to the left and the guy to the right was doing in their industry, the better than, or, the leaders and the laggards, or how do you stack up? And then more importantly, from an intentional and an execution perspective, what do you intend for the future compared to where you are today? And that basic common sense framework really drives the whole process in terms of how do we feel about a given company and what they're trying to be, and particularly with regard to things in the world of sustainability and responsible investing. And so it is today that, we manage across, we do cash management, we have fixed income, we have exchange traded fund strategies that are all kind of optimized in that direction. It's a complement to what we do for our traditional people because not everybody wants it.
Right.
And not everybody feels that that's an important driver for them. But for those clients that do, we do, very outwardly illustrate that. And even for those who don't, believe in all the standards of practice in, essentially environmental analysis and in social assessment and so forth, we still use it.
Yeah.
But we're not advertising it in the sense of, their portfolios and so forth. A good company is a good company. And if they have good standards, oddly enough, they're going to show forth in any kind of ESG assessment. And it's going to show forth in their credit quality rating assessment by Moody's and S&P. It's going to show forward in their trends in terms of their earnings and their ability to accrete capital value over a long-term time frame. All of that is there to see, but the reasons for it have to be attributable to certain things.
Right.
And I think that's where, the whole analysis that we bring to bear gives us a little bit of a value add for our clients.
Yeah, there's a lot to unwind on that one. Particularly as it relates to the traditional energy asset. I think we're operating in a space right now where ESG, the term, has become a little bit more controversial than it should, frankly, because you're spot on. It's like the governance evaluation never really went anywhere, and there's nothing controversial about that. But it seems like we've substituted the term ESG for decarbonization and sustainability. I think I know the answer to this, but in terms of balancing global decarbonization goals with long-term asset valuations, like how do you reconcile that? Like what thought process, what methodology do you employ to ensure that you don't do too little or don't do too less, and that you're overcorrecting yourself for 4 or 5 years?
Sure. I think with us, I think the backdrop is very important. Why do you do this? Well, according to Bloomberg, I just read last week, last year in 2024, we created something on the order of 37.4 billion tons of CO2. That's through, our fossil fuels that we use, and then the cement production that we create. And that's according to the Global Carbon Project, right? And, you sit there and say, oh my goodness, all this carbon capture, capability that we've been investing in has hardly put a dent in this thing. And so we have a lot of work to do. And so when you look at that as a reason for why, then you have to sit there and say, okay, how do I tackle this? So there are kind of 5 things that we would do. First is your portfolio strategy. What does that look like? We believe that you want to diversify across, the traditional area, which is oil and gas. And you want to look at guys that are leaders rather than laggards in terms of all the transition issues that you might want them to be good at in terms of how they do their business. The other is what is transitional. That area you're talking about, perhaps natural gas is being a transitional kind of, energy source. And then the long term is the renewable as far as we're concerned. So we want to allocate short-term capital to fossil fuel traditional stuff.
Okay.
Long-term capital, growth capital has to be more canted towards the renewable. That's the first thing. Then you want to be an active steward in this. You just can't sit on your hands and say, okay, let her rip and I'll just won't pay attention to it. So, you want to, particularly with the traditional energy companies, you want to look for managements that are leaning toward cleaner practices and things like methane reduction and so forth, and methane capture and so forth.
Continuous monitoring, certification.
It's sad to say that, here the U.S. doesn't come in even on a close second in many cases. Here you've got the Europeans, Total, Eni, Equinor. These are all the companies in our assessment are kind of in that area. We also want to look at the services guys, the guys that are producing the equipment and the services, the Schlumbergers of this world, because they are going to lead the charge in terms of clean technology and clean resource management in the fossil fuel community. And the more that they can bring that to bear, then fine. And so we want to invest in those companies because they're change agents.
Right.
Okay. We also want to look at it from a risk management perspective. So we're going to model. We're going to look at stranded assets because, look, peak consumption, some would say, is going to be somewhere in the year between 2035 to 2045 in terms of fossil fuel. You start to roll over and say, okay, fine. Well, there are going to be stranded assets under a scenario of, a 1.5, Celsius kind of degree world where we're getting warmer, 3 degrees. Oh my goodness, what happens, in that kind of environment? So you want to stress test your holdings and say, okay, these companies are exposed to these risks. What does that mean if we actually arrive at that kind of environmental threshold?
Do you think we'll be at peak consumption in that time frame?
It depends on what all the other new things, actually bring along. Okay. And so if we're talking nuclear, if we're talking about hydrogen, green, blue, whatever color you like, but the fact matter is, I don't know at what rate of progression that those come online, versus the more established. Okay. And then it's a question of the regulatory environment, whether or not they allow this to happen at a faster rate than what we've seen historically. For now, those are the numbers that we work with because the IEA and others are kind of out there suggesting this is kind of what the future might look like. Whether or not you can put a lot of stock in it, we'll see.
Yeah.
But we want to do the modeling, and you want to make sure, on a worst case basis, what am I looking at here in terms of a marooned asset kind of that I've invested in? Then you want to look at the transition opportunities in the sense of, who's in the new tech, whether we're talking batteries, hydrogen, carbon capture, infrastructure, clean energy, all of those things. How much are companies invested in the future as opposed to we're just going to do what we've always done and we're not going to change?
Yeah.
And, there are some companies out there that I would say, a BP is probably a good example. Antero's another one, EQT. They're not wonderful companies, but they're kind of going in the right direction as far as we're concerned. Okay. Sometimes, you're looking at companies, it's not a question of looking for the best of the best. It's really kind of those who are trying to do the best they can. I will tell you that under the current administration with the new environment, the chains are off. There's been a lot of rebranding, a lot of different storytelling by the energy community about what they're all about and what they intend to do compared to where they were 3-4 years ago.
Yeah, there's definitely an about face. What was interesting on that is I've actually heard Zeldin talk, and he's taken a lot of the wind out of the enthusiasm sales because on the surface, the thought of deregulation is like, wow, there's more bourbon in the punch bowl, right? But what Zeldin is saying, at least in relatively smaller circles, deregulation does not mean that the party's going on. Deregulation is the opportunity to showcase for the world that y'all can self-police without overbearing rules. And so you cannot put yourself in a position where you ruin it for everybody.
Right.
It'll be an interesting experiment to see, right? We're also writing this piece. It's released next week after the break. We're recording this on right before Memorial Day. I'm a big fan of behavioral economics, right? Malcolm Gladwell's book, Blink, that's sort of like my mini Bible.
Sure.
It's very clear to me that an incentive-based system is much more enticing and much more appealing for participation. So I'm hopeful that there'll be more incentives in place for methane intensity reduction, carbon capture, continuous monitoring, all of that. Do you guys have conversations with management teams in that regard, or where do you think the trajectory of that's going?
When we engage, it's, first of all, we're primarily a fixed income guy, not an equity guy. We're always shown the back pew of the church when it comes to the information officers at various companies in terms of, okay, I would like to find out more. I'd like to engage. Well, who are you? Well, I'm one of your bond investors. Oh, well, yeah, we'll get to you.
Yeah, there's a little pitch
yeah.
over there, sir.
But there are good companies, I have to say, that are very happy to engage and do want to talk about these things. And for us, when we're sitting here, trying to assess what's going on, we really want to know, what is your position on resource management? What is your position on things like carbon capture, renewables? How are you connected to those trends? Are you intentionally connected, or are you getting dragged along? Are you doing it just because your competitors are doing it, right? So you have to look at the reason for it, and then what's the sustainability of that intensity, okay? The other thing is, how much do you benefit by it?
Yeah.
There are certain industries, let's be clear, that no matter how well you manage yourself, you're never going to get out of, the way of the carbon generation that's going on in the business and so forth, right? But that doesn't mean that you're let off the hook, right? That's where there has to be science applied, new technology brought into focus, and there has to be collaboration within the industry. Okay. And we want to see that. Let's talk about the extractive industries, particularly if you're looking at some of the sensitive metals and so forth. Are you associated with the international metals mining kind of principles?
Yeah.
How do you mine? Where do you mine? What are the principles with regard to the environment, with regard to the communities that you're, affecting and so forth? So we want to make sure that there is, at every opportunity, there's a chance for them to illustrate that so that we feel confident in it. That's not just us. Look, Moody's and Standard & Poor's are all sitting there asking the same questions.
Right.
They're the ones that are passing judgment. To the extent that you don't meet, their criteria, guess what's going to happen? Your cost of capital is going to go up, okay? Because you just got a downgrade, or you have a problem that puts pressure on your rating. And so we want to know that. And whether or not we agree with them, that's up to us. But as a good fiduciary, and this is the thing that really, knocks the bejesus out of me, is that we are very pragmatic in what we do. We're very common sense in what we do, in looking at a variety of different risks that we think have the ability to give us a sense of what the future looks like. If you think you can predict the future by looking at last year's earnings statement and the last 5 years of cash flow statement and today's balance sheet, I don't know how you do that.
Right.
You need to have things that are a little bit more predictive in terms of what is going on with this company. What will these practices lead to? What's the likely outcome? And how far are they from that goal? Because I want that goal reached.
What are some of the things you're looking at that gives you a little bit more confidence in the prediction for the future?
Well, again, I'm going to sit there and say, okay, let's talk about resource management. You're a water-intensive industry, okay? Let's talk about the practices. Let's talk about, how you're talking about recycling. If you are recycling, great point. Just in today's news, all the frackers.
Yeah.
Now we've got a problem here in the great state of Texas. All the water used for fracking, which is laced with toxic chemicals, we know that. is now being pumped back down into the water tables. All of that tends to leach out, Lord knows where.
Right.
And this has created now an environmental challenge.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what are you doing about that? Are you part of the party that's just shoving it back down into the earth and say, well, it's not my fault anymore? We want responsible players. We want people to say, that's a problem. We need to address that. And how do we do that? And I think that's the issue for us is, it's the natural resource management.
Yeah.
And then the second part of what are the secondary effects that you're going to have on stakeholders,
Right.
the communities, that you operate in. How are you supporting them? Because just buying more hospital beds because a lot of cancer patients here, gee, I wonder why, isn't necessarily the best way to accomplish that. Direct investment. And those are things that are important. And also, how are you in the realm of negotiating regulatory practices? What are you pushing for? What's your lobby pushing for?
Mm-hmm.
Those are things that we also need to know about, because if you're saying one thing to your investors and doing another thing out in the field, we need to address that. And if it's okay because you have somehow or another lobbied for a regulatory change that allows you to essentially pursue the practice that's adverse to the environment and adverse to the stakeholders other than management, then we need to kind of sit down and think about that.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about just domestically for the most part, right? But what's interesting in what I giggle about is we were introduced by a mutual friend, let's call it 4 or 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And Chris said, you have to ask him about China. Ask him about China. And I'm going somewhere with this. The thing that I've noticed over the last 2-3 years, but especially since Trump took office, is there's a greater emphasis on China's influence on the supply chain.
Mm-hmm.
And we see the investment community place a greater emphasis on to what extent do you rely on China. Now you have all these geopolitical considerations with reshoring and China, Taiwan, and all this other stuff. Your take on China, I thought, was fascinating, and particularly when you talk about the globe is emitting all this CO2 and we have this global issue. What I get frustrated on sometimes is, the United States is 15% of global emissions. China is, let's call it 30%. What are your observations on how people are evaluating China and the risks that they inherently present with any portfolio?
Mm-hmm. China is a very ticklish situation.
It's a good one.
When you look at it in terms of supply chains and how much they control or dominate in terms of what would be considered critical elements, critical products that we need in the supply chains of what we're constructing, whether it's in the energy field, whether it's in the food, pharmaceuticals, and so forth. Calling somebody a bad name, well, they basically control your life in certain aspects, is politically difficult.
Mm-hmm.
I would say the current administration is showing us how difficult and how interesting the reactions can be. But let's look at this. First thing is, when we look at China, you got to look at, the mineral supply chain, right? Okay. So today I'm just jotting down my notes is that China has dominance. They control 90% of rare earths. Yep. 90%, 60 to 70% of lithium and cobalt production, 90% of graphite. Hello, tech community.
Yeah.
Hello, semiconductors.
Exactly.
Hello, medical field, with x-rays and imaging and so forth.
Everything.
So it's difficult to have a lot of negotiating power when that is kind of hanging over your head.
Right.
We let ourselves get there, and China very smartly, said, well, we're going to advance, where we can advance. And this was something that was expressed 30 years ago in the years of Nixon when he went over to open up with China. And the world was, at that point in time, I was in Riyadh, and, we were looking at oil prices spiking through the roof in the late 70s, early 80s. And the Chinese just sat back and said, well, we may not have oil. We do have rare earths. And that is, in essence, our oil.
Right.
They were smart.
Yeah.
And I don't think that at that point we really looked at it. But, in terms of price volatility and kind of geopolitical disruptions, they are not afraid to wield their axe. They did so to China, rather Japan. Japan had discovered a very vast, very mineable, commercially viable deposit of various rare earths and so forth in the beaches or in the ocean just to the eastern coast of Japan.
Okay.
They started developing that, started mining that, and extracting, rare earths. Well, China basically said put the kibosh on it and flatten the pricing in the market that essentially forced capital out of that project, and so it's never going to be viable. They also tried to do that to the Australian producers.
Okay.
And so
Recently, or when was this?
this is over the course of the last decade.
Okay.
And so there have been bouts where they have flexed their muscles and basically chased competitive capital away. And so you got to sit there and say, okay, I got to map my supply chains. I've got to look at where the disruption points are and how likely is it that I can overcome it without going through a tremendous amount of stress. We're not there yet. We're very far away from that. Then you look at, the renewable manufacturing. China produces about 60% of the solar panels, that the world is working with, 52% of EV batteries. Here's a great little story. And this is why you got Reuters reported on the 14th. I don't know if you saw it, but we have discovered in maintaining a lot of the Chinese manufactured solar panels that have been put into our electrical grid system, that as they open them up and they go and repair them and so forth, that there is a component in there which is very important to the what do they call that? An inverter, electrical inverter. And of course, every repairman gets the repair book, and he says, okay, these are the parts that are supposed to be in there. Well, lo and behold, they discovered that there was an apparatus inside some of the solar panels that wasn't supposed to be there.
Like a spy tech.
Like we can shut your system down tech.
Really?
Remote control. And so this has been brought to the attention. The U.S. government knows. This is last week in Reuters.
Now, embarrassed I haven't heard the story, but I'm glad you bring it up.
And everybody is now very surprised. One, China is, we don't know how that got there.
What is this?
The fact of the matter is that after opening several different units across the country, we've now found that it's not only in the solar panels, also in the batteries that they've also been selling us as well. And so whether or not it's spyware, it's probably more a control item where perhaps you don't want the grid to operate. So let's just shut it down.
Yeah.
So let's pull a Spain on that. Like we saw, 10 days ago. And
Have we seen the satellite picture?
It's amazing.
Insane.
Yeah. Black hole.
Yeah. It's like,
What happened to Spain?
Portugal.
Oh, it went for a walk.
Yeah, exactly. France lit up, Portugal lit up, Spain.
Yeah. No, when you read news clippings of that nature, you have to try and figure out, okay, where does the real international geopolitical competition end and where does the business competition begin? Okay. China, it's so blurred, you can't figure it out half the time. And so, you also have regulatory opacity there. You don't know what the regulations are. They can come here in the United States and they know chapter and verse.
Yep.
Here's your book of regulations, and they go through it in detail and they understand it. That's not true in China in terms of how they operate. Whether it's with businesses from over offshore that are coming in to try and operate there, or it's their own businesses in terms of what their priorities are. The priorities in a centrally managed economy, such as that is, come from on high. It's not a democratic process. It's not, democratic capitalism in any form, shape that we know it. So that's a problem. And I think that from a geopolitical perspective, you have to sit there and look at China and say, what does China want to do? Well, they've publicly declared that we want to be the superpower of the world. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to have the largest army. But if they have control of every critical element that drives your energy grid, if they have control of various supply chain sea lanes, call it Taiwan, which produces, the vast majority of semiconductors that are used by the Western world, they pretty much got you bottled up.
Right.
And so I think we're in a process here of playing catch up.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we have been foolish and naive in allowing China to advance itself as deeply as it has in many of the what we would call critical industries. We see it going on now in AI.
Yeah.
We thought we had them bottled up in AI. We thought that we're in charge. We have all the players on the chessboard, and we're going to win. Well, then all of a sudden, DeepSeek comes out, and they're like, "Whoa, where did that come from?" And so you have to sit there and say, look, if we're going to play this game of chess, we have to play it a lot more smartly than we have done. The reliance that we have because of their dominance is still so very, very strong. We need to wean that off. And, I heard here's another one. 90%, 80% of the drugs that we take here in the United States are generic. Okay. Generic drugs are created for the most part in two places, the ingredients, China and India.
Yeah.
Those supply chains are what I would call critical. And so what are we doing about it? It's not just about the energy. It's not just about, the defense side of things. It's also about the medical side.
Right.
And so I think that when we look at China, to use the word adversary would be difficult because, quite frankly, they want
frenemy being spit out.
Well, I don't know even if frenemy is the word anymore, but they are a competitor.
Yeah.
And I think that, from a business perspective, we need to giddy up. And I think if there's anything to be said about the current administration, there is no laxity in that department. I think President Trump is ringing the alarm bell in a way that it needs to be done. There has to be some shock value applied to our thinking because we've been very complacent with China.
Do you think that was sort of the motivation behind some of the tariff policy?
Well, no question. I think that what President Trump understands is that throughout most of the world, particularly in the emerging economies, that the way you negotiate is through strength, through power, through almost brute force sometimes, because that's just the way of the world. And having lived offshore and having seen lots of different regimes in my lifetime, I understand it. It doesn't mean I agree with it, but it's just the way of the world. And I think that that's an important thing for us to understand.
You don't agree with it, or you don't like it, or both?
I think it's kind of both. It depends. There is in China a vast amount of what you don't know about the state of society, how the state of healthcare, the state of employment, and being able to live a rational life. Well, it's a controlled economy. That's different than what we see in perhaps the Middle East. It's probably different than what we see in Africa. There are various different forms of this. So some you can live with more than others. Okay, but again, what we have to come to grips with here with China is that they're not going to go away. We will not defeat them in the absolute sense. What we need to do is to come to some level of equivocation where we or where we have an equal standing, and we're capable to essentially trade punches with deliberateness and with effectiveness. And right now we're not very effective.
Does that mean in part, or in practice, I should say, to bring the supply chain back to the United States to reshore that?
Reshoring is the whole deal.
Okay.
Or friendshoring. Okay. Another way of looking at it. I think that we have to be very, very attuned to that idea, but we can't lose sight of the sustainability issues.
Well, that's what I was going with this. So
Sure.
if you have the state of the state water, for example, let's just take that. We've written about this ad nauseum, and I know you're passionate about this, but the state of water in the United States isn't great. The state of infrastructure isn't spectacular either. We need a lot of work, CapEx, innovation, upgrade, etc. on infrastructure. We tend to get caught up in the first leg of the power story, like just source. We don't talk about transmission, and distribution. That's not in the state.
Or refining.
Or refining, for that matter. And so where I'm going with this is you have this geopolitical, let's call it impetus, to bring all this stuff back to the United States, which will compound the issues that we already have, right? Access to energy in terms of increasing demand, aging infrastructure, water stress, all of this stuff. Like, how do we, and once again, inflationary environment where it's not necessarily the easiest environment to get stuff done. Like we see this with nuclear in the permitting process. Like, I'm not saying you whip out the Bob Smith magic wand, but how do we account for this? Like, what do we do?
But there has to be a set of priorities that I think have to be laid out on a national basis, which we're not there yet because we're trying to get the big, beautiful bill across.
Yeah.
Okay. And
which it sounds like last night there seems like they've made a major milestone.
Well, here's the thing. The big, beautiful bill to some degree is, meant to terrorize a lot of what was started in the Inflation Recovery Act. Okay. We're going to degreen this thing as much as we can, right? Some of it is rightfully so, but I think there are elements of the IRA that we should retain because, yes, our national power grid is in not very great shape.
Right.
We need a tremendous amount of investment in that regard, particularly when you think about the rise and the emergence of data centers and the rise of AI and the rise of everything that needs to have some form of electrification and power generation. The numbers are boggling people's minds about what the demand is going to be. We're nowhere near meeting that from a capacity and from a production standpoint. I mean, do I have the lines, the grid, and so forth? So what are we doing? Even myself, I'm invested in a biogas operation, which right now is being negotiated by a group that is putting data centers together. And to the extent that we can get dairy farmers to essentially supply, manure, whether pig, cow, we're indifferent. Pigs are better out. But the fact of the matter is that biogas, it may not be refinable or refined enough to be accepted by, let's say, the state of California to be put into their grid.
Yeah.
But sure, you can put that out back right next to your data center and, fire that baby up, okay? And that is an interesting supply issue, but it's only good for certain parts of the country. And so we have an issue here of regionalization in terms of what part of the country do you live in? What do you need most? Because there is no one-size-fits-all. And I think that's where we get caught up. And what works, let's say, up in Wisconsin and up in the Lake Districts and so forth, may be the biogas and could be hydro and so forth. But that isn't going to work in Arizona. Not going to work in a lot of Texas. And so those are things that we think are important that have not been addressed yet. And we want to see more of that. Here's where corporate America needs to help provide direction.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that that's what's lacking here. There has to be a call it a commission, call it a whatever group you want to put together. But
Or
just
like
like you did with Doge,
coalition or
a
something.
coalition and of corporate leaders who are very much involved with the infrastructure of the United States in terms of power transmission and so forth, storage, all of those things, and say, look, these are the biggest priorities nationwide. Regionally, here's how they differ. Here's what the CapEx is going to be, and here is the period of time it's going to take to improve it, and here's your payback. Here's your internal rate of return.
Right.
I haven't seen that laid out.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen buy-in by corporate America yet. Why? Because they're all been dancing around, uncertainty. It's all tariff uncertainty. Well, how do tariffs, impact your industry and how much uncertainty is there in that? And I'd say if you're getting your supplies in terms of your finished metal materials from China, if you're getting some certain rare earth materials from China, sure, I could see that. But it isn't necessarily the only holdback at this point.
And it's a great point that the C word, right? The certainty. And so we did this thing where we looked at the events over the last 5 years between COVID, Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, inflation. I mean, the list goes on, and as cliche as it sounds, it's like uncertainty is the new certainty. And where we also get a little bit irritated is we look at the concept of sustainability as this binary consideration, like we need it or we don't. And the argument, I think, is it's not gone away with. It's being repositioned because times are evolving, and they're evolving really, really quick, particularly when you take into account these geopolitical considerations, China being first and foremost. One of the things that we were just talking about and why that's relevant, you brought this up in our conversation before we started recording. Like, China is building nuclear power plants like it's going out of style. Like, so is Russia. So you have these two countries who, for all intents and purposes, are our adversaries. There has to be something with them building up all these nuclear power plants, yet we get in our own way because of the permitting process and the overregulation, and we just can't do it. Like, do you think we are behind on the nuclear scene, and what do you think has to be put in place for it to level out?
I think we are technologically advanced. We look, we led the world for very, very, very many years in terms of nuclear technology. French probably coming in right behind us. Okay, somehow or another we lost that.
Why do you think we lost that?
Because it wasn't a focal point, because fossil fuels were very low cost, energy demand, was very gradual, the growth of the economy is very predictable and so forth. Now, why disturb it, don't fix it if it's not
Right,
there's a
complacency to set it just because there wasn't a need.
Exactly. And so now we've shifted. We're in a different world. Whether you believe the IEA or not, whether we're going to see, peak production capability in 2030, 2040, whatever the case is. The fact of the matter is, I don't think anybody is going to agree that God is now replenishing all the oil that we've taken out over the last 30 years. It's not going to happen. And so at some point, you will get to a turning point where it becomes too expensive to extract. It's not worthwhile. It's not practical. And golly gee, there's got to be better alternatives out there. Nuclear is it. I think that when you think about it, the entire U.S. Navy, every major battleship, every aircraft carrier has been powered by small modular reactors for decades and decades. And none of our sailors are coming off the boat glowing like glow bugs, okay, after they do their tour. Okay, exactly.
From the ears.
Yeah, you have to sit there and say, where did we give up? Yeah. And I don't think it was so much to give up. We lost focus.
Okay.
And I think right now, when you look at companies like NuScale, you look at Oklo, you look at Nano Nuclear, GE Vernova, okay, all of these companies are leading the pack in terms of the technology. And I think the issue here is regulation.
Okay.
And preventing that from occurring at the rate that it needs to, because China is building SMRs at an extremely rapid rate. And we know that they are very advanced in building coal-fired plants out, like every day of the week, there's a new coal-fired plant.
Literally.
The same is happening, is being reported, the same is happening with the SMRs. And so we're falling behind in that sense. Well, China has a desperation because while President Trump likes to boast that we are the largest energy producer in the world, that is not the case for China. China is energy devoid in terms of natural resources, okay?
Yeah.
And so they have to beg, borrow, and steal, whether it's with Russia, whether it's with Iran, the Middle East, and so forth, which is why the Middle East trip was really important, because China is looking at Africa, and they're looking at the Middle East and say, you know what? If we treat these guys nice, we may be able to get better terms and more energy resources while we're building out all of this other alternative story. Right. The other little hidden story that I think is really important that we've kind of lost sight of, but it's going to happen, is fusion. And so, when you look at molten salt technology like TerraPower with Bill Gates, those types of things, because everybody is afraid that we're going to have a Chernobyl, another Chernobyl or a Fukushima. And so the fact of the matter is that those are relatively small occurrences in the scheme of how many do we have, how many years have they been operating, and so forth. So I think that we're pretty good from a regulatory and compliance and from a safety perspective. Now the question is, can we find better technology? I think fusion is the next chapter. Fusion is just maybe somewhere in the area of about a decade to a decade and a half away from a commercially viable capability.
You think it's that far?
I think again, it's all you can really talk about is what you read.
Yeah.
Because I'm not inside, but I have a company here somewhere that is Commonwealth Fusion Systems. They say that commercial fusion by the 2030s is possible.
Okay.
Now, I haven't really looked into a lot of the background in Commonwealth Fusion.
Yeah.
But you don't make statements like that if you don't think you have something that's really viable,
Right.
right? And so I think that, we are only at the beginning of this renewable energy nuclear story.
Yeah.
And whether it's fission or fusion, I don't know how that's going to advance. I think obviously fission is here and now. How small can I make these babies? And, whether or not I can put this outside my data, storage or data processing building, which is now the size of 3 football fields, and power the whole thing up. We'll see.
We've had several guests on now that confirm this, all obviously unrelated, where one of the interesting attributes of nuclear is the generational feelings, right? You have a younger demographic that is very pro-nuclear, right? They are anti-fossil fuel, unfortunately, but they are very pro-nuclear, whereas the older generations tend to err more on the anti-nuclear. We had Emmett Penny and Scott Tinker who said exactly the same thing, like that is a generational component.
I believe it.
Do you think that will play a role in getting the regulatory burden eliminated for nuclear, or is that still something that we feel is going to hold?
The science the science of nuclear physics is we understand it, we know it, and
Right.
Fusion's a whole other thing. But on fission, we understand it. It's whether or not we can build the right kind of mechanisms that can contain it, control it, and maximize it efficiently without hurting, the surrounding communities. I think the one thing that we do have that the past generations didn't have is the benefit of advanced knowledge produced through AI. Every technocrat will tell you that, yes, it's a really proven technology, but if I applied AI to it, and whether it's medical technology, whether it's in the computer world, whether it's energy, whatever, every major producer in those fields is saying AI is just going to heighten the level of productivity and increase the efficiency, reduce the cost. All of those are virtues and attributes, and we didn't have that 30 years ago.
Right.
Okay. And so I'm sitting here saying, well, you take that, component and you kind of mix it into, where are we on nuclear and how fast can we advance it and how quickly can we get the nuclear bodies to feel comfortable with all the safety that we've built into the system and so forth. The energy source that we're using here different, and, uranium. Yes, we're using molten salt. Here's what we can prove. Here's what AI can show you in terms of the models that we built. I think all of those things are with a different slice. With a younger generation who is very much tied into AI, very much tied into, the need for power because they see the growth and the development of it. I think they're going to be okay with it, better than their grandparents and, perhaps their parents, but grandparents for the most part.
Yeah, it is interesting because with the younger crowd, particularly, they're more sensitive, generally speaking, to the emission story. But you have these 3 tenets where you have national security, which everyone agrees that should be a priority. You have the emergence of generative AI, which everyone is increasingly relying upon on a daily basis. And then you have emissions, right? Those things sometimes are in direct conflict with one another. But where I think the younger crowd, and certainly across generational profiles, but certainly much more, it seems, with the younger generation, the prioritization is emissions. And there needs to be this educational process that you can't have emissions management without a sound economic foundation, first and foremost. And you have to ensure that you have supply chain, logistics, and national security as a pretty solid number 2.
Well, therein lies the rub, and we get back to infrastructure.
Okay.
When you actually sit down and think about it, I need to have processed fuel rods and I need to have the right level of uranium refined to the right capacity that I can then put it into my unit.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is that 50% or more of that is controlled by Russia.
Yeah.
The Clinton administration gave it away, okay? And nobody thought of it at the time because all we had were 99, those big towers, 3 Mile Island kind of stuff, and nobody really worried about it. And the guys in the Navy that need to power their equipment, we get just enough. We don't have refining capacity here. We're only building the new plant now in Oklahoma
Okay.
to do that. We are woefully behind the curve on that. And so when you sit there and you say, oh my goodness, I'm focused a lot on digging out uranium, and I've invested in that, and I have investments in that. And I say, sure, source material is important. How do I transfer that from raw source material into a finished rod that can be then input into or as a source component to my unit to fuel it? That's where Russia comes in. That's where we are highly dependent, and you don't create one of those overnight. And so we need to have more of these processing units that allow us to create and refine uranium to the point where it can be used efficiently.
Is that one of the fears? I mean, similar to China having the kill switch, if you will.
Oh yeah.
On that where else can you is Russia the only place?
No, China is also very much involved in that.
Better.
So yeah, no, I mean, everything with regard to power generation in this country that matters in terms of renewables and lower emissions, I will tell you right now that China and Russia have a stranglehold on because we haven't invested enough. We haven't done it fast enough. We're waking up to it now. But I think that, we're going to need to advance at a lot quicker pace than people imagine.
Does that advancement come at the expense of sustainability related directives, or can you have your cake and eat it too?
I would hope that anything that we do will have a sustainability component to it in terms of we have to hardwire it in terms of what kind of emission standards do we expect if we make this investment or this subsidy and so forth. We need to hardwire that in and make, corporate managements agree to these metrics. We're not.
How do you do that?
The EPA is not of that mind at the moment.
Right.
Okay.
So, and that was sort of where I was like, how do you do that? Like well, in fairness, this is where I'll lovingly push back a little bit. Like we had this experiment where top-down overregulation didn't necessarily result in the things that we wanted, and simultaneously, like voluntary bottom-up just probably won't do the same. Like, what does that balance look like? Do you think?
I think that what we've learned is that we had unrealistic, aspirational overreach on the part of the prior administration. Okay. And we learned a hard lesson from that. Yeah. But we did wake up to the fact that there were some things that could be accomplished. Look how much of our national power grid is now powered by renewables. Think about what that was even 10 years ago. And it was, that's crazy, Well, it's not. It's actually in the state of Texas, a significant amount, okay? And when I tell people how much power is being generated by wind and solar in this state, land of the fossil fuel, okay, they just like, oh no, that can't be. It's true. And how much is nuclear? And so the fact of the matter is that I don't think we tell the story the right way.
Right.
And I don't think that we make it a black or white issue.
Yeah.
We don't make this an all of the above issue.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I think that we need to do that a bit more. And to your point, the voters of the future are the ones that are the most tied into wanting and desiring a cleaner environment, a lower emission environment, a decarbonized environment, replenishable power and energy that doesn't get us into wars with other people and arguments and destabilizations in terms of the economic environment that we're in, which is what we're experiencing now.
Right.
This makes them older before their years. Okay, they're worried about it.
Yeah.
And so to the extent they don't even want to have babies anymore. And so you sit there and go, wait a minute. This uncertainty, as short-term as you may think it is sitting in the minds of your young voters. You need to come up with these kind of solutions, and you need to showcase them in a much more constructive, positive manner. That doesn't mean that you have to swing completely away from where you think your core value set is with regard to energy and energy production and decarbonization. But you do have to give a little bit here because, again, we're dumping, as I said, almost 35 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere.
When you say we, is that the U.S. or is that the
global?
Global.
Okay. U.S., oh, we're good, we're bad. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
It's not an us versus them kind of thing. It's everyone. And I think that's the thing that we lose track of because emissions, regardless of where they come from, they're going to come wafting through your air if they're produced in Asia. And whatever we produce is going to go all the way over to Europe.
It's not regionalized. It's the atmosphere.
No, but, you want everybody kind of pulling in the same direction with the same intensity.
How do you keep China in check then? Like China, it seems like they're going to do whatever they want to do whenever they want to do it. Like is it through the tariffs? Is it through like this CBAM stuff, carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe? Is it like how do you rein them in?
I don't know that we can rein them in or contain them with the mindset that's in place and in power at the moment. Because their drive is to become number one, no question, and everybody else got to be 2, 3, 4, whatever number you want to pick. But we want to be the leaders of the world, and we know he who controls the power and controls the means of manufacturing is probably going to have a pretty good stranglehold on that position. Where you can deal with them are things like, what does your agricultural production look like? We know China is buying up all kinds of agricultural land in the United States.
Which is insane, by the way. Like, I hear that, and it's mind-boggling to me.
Well, it indicates an inherent weakness.
Yeah.
You have one of the largest populations on the planet, aging population, I might add. And you sit there and you say, okay, well, what is it that you need from me? Because you're not going to eat soybeans every day. Okay. And great, you produce a lot of those. But yes, you like corn. Yes, you like wheat. Yes, you like my meat products and so forth. And so I think you have to be very strategic in terms of understanding where is the give and take in our relationship. And where can we be, very forceful in getting our point across, and where do we need to give some ground until we get into a better position on the board? And I think those are things that we don't really illustrate very well, and we don't really bring out in public. So here's what we're driving towards, and we understand that we control this, and this, and we would like you to behave in this way, and we think it's a fair thing to ask for. Now, that's negotiations. But I think that, China is not a panacea. It doesn't have everything it needs every day.
Right.
It has to trade with the world. And it needs also to be able to sell to the world.
Right.
Okay.
We're
massive consumers.
Isn't like their 60% of their GDP comes from manufacturing?
Yeah.
Which requires immense amounts of electricity.
Exactly. And so you sit there and say, okay, guys, we're just going to go somewhere else to buy whatever widget, whatever piece of clothing, whatever it is that you want to sell us. And I think that's where they start to listen and say, well, look, we have to have our people fed. They have to have an income. Otherwise, we have insurrection.
Yeah.
Political instability is in nobody's interest, right? I think the other hidden, I don't know if you call it dark horse, the underappreciated community that I think is going to continue to wage more and more economic and engineering power is India.
Okay.
And if you
we're seeing this now kind of with India, Pakistan, right?
Absolutely. But if you look at India from just from a demographic perspective, they're in far better shape than the Chinese are.
Okay. In terms of like just health, longevity,
age of the population, education of the population, relationships around the world. Who does China really want to dominate? They just want to be well protected within their borders. There are perhaps some regional issues with Pakistan and so forth, but for the most part, they have a very, very productive, youthful workforce that is going to be very effective for decades to come, and they are promoting that. We have brought tremendous number of Indian nationals into the U.S. economy. They have a very deep-rooted position within our high-tech community as well. Just go to California. You'll see it, and that's wonderful. And I think that they are a much more of an ally than they are a contender to compete with the United States head on in terms of being in control of things.
Right.
And I think that's, in my opinion, that is an investment that you want to be making. You want to invest in India. You want to, now, they obviously have their environmental issues, they have their emission issues and so forth. But, that I think that you also have the largest population on the planet. Just like I said earlier on in the conversation, understand what can and cannot be managed away. And if it can be managed away, what time periods are we talking about? And I think that transitioning people off of fossil fuels in that community is very, very difficult.
Yes.
Just because of the geographic nature of that landmass and, what the people are capable of affording and so forth. And so I think for me, and even for my own portfolio, I'm invested in India because I think that is a very bright future. I am not invested in China.
Yeah.
And I don't trust also what I get in terms of reports from China. Numbers are managed and massaged very often. That's you hear that as a very common refrain as to, okay, do you really trust those numbers?
Right.
India, you don't get the same kind of feeling. You don't get the same kind of pushback. And it's a very engaging community where they're very open arm and they embrace and want to be partners. They want to be, transparent. I don't get that in terms of China as an operating mechanism in terms of how they comport themselves.
What do you think about, what do you think about Europe then? So you bring up a really good point, this decoupling and lowering the reliance of the supply chain on China. And, there's only a couple other places you can go. You mentioned India, but in Europe, you have this regulatory environment that just is not business friendly at all. And you have a lot of people, we've had a lot of people on this show. We had Amy Miller runs an advocacy group out of Europe, and she's talking about the ability for the Europeans just to compete is they're losing their ability to compete. You see this in Germany, right? With the flip flop, we're like, we're going green. No, we're not. Get rid of nuke. That was a bad idea. Give me some coal. And now their economy is suffering. Like, how do you analyze or how do you view the trajectory of Europe and how does that influence sort of the risk premium that you put on any company that is increasingly relying more on the European supply chain?
Again, I think you can do that in the short term. On a long run basis, I'm not sure. I mean, there in Europe, you have a clash of aspirations versus realities. And the realities of life have been very harsh for them because of their proximity to Mother Russia and their major, fuel source. And there have been all kinds of issues from blowing up each other's supply lines under the water and all so forth. I think that the thing with Europe is also in love with regulation.
Yeah.
They have overregulated.
And they allow themselves some compliance.
Oh, absolutely.
It's so weird.
Altruistically, it's great, guys. That's wonderful. But it isn't going to pull capital your way. Now, here's an interesting statistic. Because I was looking at this the other day, and I'm like, oh, man, I didn't realize that.
While you're pulling it up, one of the interesting anecdotes, me and Sterling were talking about this. We coincidentally I went to Amsterdam for a speech. And when I was walking, the light's red, but there's no cars coming. So I just crossed the street. And I didn't think twice about it. And everyone's looking at me like I just robbed the bank. And like, what are you doing? I was with a colleague who's European. Like, what are you doing? I'm like, I'm crossing the street. They're like, yeah, but the cross sign wasn't green. I'm like, who cares? They're like, no, like it's, like, well, you crossed it.
Arrogant risk taker.
Yeah. They're like, it was, and they thought I was like some, crazy cowboy here.
Yeah.
There's 0 cars on the street.
Yeah.
And why would I wait for that thing? And that it was like mind blowing to them. They just could not understand that I disobeyed the traffic light across the street.
Oh yeah,
insane.
Oh yeah. I mean, we
probably didn't know I was wearing my boots.
Mind the gap. Mind the gap. You're standing there and waiting for the tube. It's like, I'm just going to jump right in, guys. But no, listen to this number. This was interesting. This came out from Morningstar because there was a report on what's going on with regard to sustainable investment.
Yes.
Okay. So in the first quarter of 2025, the United States outflows were roughly $8.6 billion. People just saying, sayonara.
That's on a quarter or the year? Sorry.
That's for the quarter.
Okay.
Okay. That is then the reverse of that in the in the fourth quarter of 2024,
Okay.
we actually saw inflows of about $18.1 billion, believe it or not. This is according to Morningstar. Now, here's the thing.
Okay.
The American investor, that was global numbers, okay? We just saw the 10th consecutive quarter that American investors yanked money from sustainable funds, $6.1 billion of withdrawals for just the quarter, right?
Okay.
Europe, which represents 84% of the global $3.2 trillion sustainable investment fund market. Think
Okay.
about that.
Yep.
84% is controlled by Europe. They saw outflows of $1.2 billion in the first quarter of this year versus inflows of $20.4 billion in the fourth quarter. But it's the first time since 2018 that the European funds have experienced any kind of outflow, the sustainable funds.
And there's probably U.S. investors pulling their money out of the European.
Could be, but it also says, look, we're not happy with what you're doing. We don't believe that what you're doing, this is not an environment that's conducive to capital growth.
Yeah.
The way you're managing it. And I think you're right. They're very strict. In some cases, almost austere. When you look at scope, 1, 2, and 3, and the level 3 kind of scope analysis, which is wet finger on a good day. But they're very adamant about it. And I appreciate the intensity of being intellectually correct.
Right.
But here again, the reality of life is that nobody can report these numbers effectively.
Right.
And so why would you put people through that? Because that involves then time, money, or a combination thereof that nobody really wants to bother with anymore, because the results aren't showing up. And I think that I always appreciate going to Europe and experiencing some of the environmental things that they have tackled, some of the social things that they've tackled. I think it was in the train station up in Stockholm. And they have kind of an ergonomically designed platform where people stepping on the floor in the station actually produces ergonomic power that is then captured and then used to essentially power the lights.
Oh, interesting.
And so, well, that's kind of interesting.
But it gets dark in Stockholm at like 2 in the afternoon.
Again, it's a question of traffic, but it's again storage, okay? Because, fine, if I generate all this ergonomic energy, that's great. It's a great contraption. How long can I store it, right? And we know that storage is also, in terms of infrastructure, a real bugaboo here because we haven't really conquered that yet.
Yeah.
And so the fluid
with that being on the horizon, like the stores. Okay.
Yes, it has to be, because all of this flow through technology of alternatives is just kind of only says, okay, I can use this for 24, maybe 48 on the outside, and I can only store this much.
Yeah.
I don't have enough capacity to store it for the city for the next week.
Right.
Okay. And so that still is a big area of infrastructure that needs to be discussed. And and again, I think the technology drive that we're seeing in terms of the data centers is going to take you there.
Yeah.
Corporate America is going to take you there, not municipal America.
Yeah, we've said this repeatedly, and it's become cliche, but I'll reiterate it. Like, the tech bros are not going to wait around. Like, they need some power, and they need it now. And you're actually seeing them go the SMR route. You're seeing them taking themselves off the grid. You're seeing these storage technologies that are employed. You're even seeing them sort of muddle around with geothermal to see if they can figure out, like, everything is on the table for them. And fortunately for them, they have the balance sheet. Like, they have the cash to be like, okay, if this doesn't work, we don't want to lose money, but this is a dent in the checkbook.
Well, I'm thinking even methane capture and storage, kind of situations. Well, I'll just put a little data center out there in the middle of West Texas and just pipe it in. I'll use it.
Language.
Yeah.
Yeah. We anticipate, like, we've seen a couple projects. It's really interesting. It's like, what doesn't anyone really want to live next to? A manure farm and a data center. Well, why can't you just get a special digester to convert the manure into RNG and then have that in the back of the data center, like in the middle of nowhere?
That's exactly it.
Or something.
And the digester is the technology. And so, yes, we have a company that is very interested in that.
Okay.
And they see the renewable nature. And the idea here is, okay, lock up all the supply contracts.
Yeah.
Who are my supply contracts? All the dairy farmers.
Yeah.
This is great. And you generate your carbon credits.
What do you think about the carbon credit market? Like, what's the state of the carbon credit market as you see it?
I think that, there was a heyday for carbon credits probably about 2-3 years ago.
Yeah.
And then it kind of fell apart. I think also the accounting for the carbon credit is also problematic. What you do in Europe versus what you do here in the United States and so forth. And then how do I value that from a regulatory perspective, and those are all things that I think are inhibiting the growth and the development of it. It's getting in front of, carbon capture systems and storage, all right, because that's the driver, that's the reason for it. It's getting in front of things like the data, the data application in terms of the biogas recapture and so forth. I don't have a smart answer for that. I just know that if you can't put a value on it and can't regulate it, right? And I think all things that are regulated all of a sudden become fashionable.
Yeah.
If you look for an example of that, just look at crypto.
Yeah.
Look at the
It needs a
massive
Yeah.
turnaround in crypto that I never would have imagined until the meme coin for Donald Trump got created. And
My wife comes to me. So like whenever it was like 4 years ago. I was like, I'm thinking about crypto, like just thinking, like I want to learn more about it. And she said, absolutely not. That's the dumbest thing ever, blah, 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 blah. And like 2 weeks ago, this true story, she comes up to me. She's like, why don't we have any crypto? I'm like, what? But, and so what I think is going to happen, I love your take on this. And it goes back to my point on the tech bros are calling the energy shots, words. You have Amazon that has essentially told everybody that they're creating this warehouse of credits that they inherently want to supply their supply chain because they cannot decarbonize without the decarbonization of their smaller, call it tier 3 through 8 suppliers. And why I think that's so relevant is even though we're going to experience this incremental, immense uptick in energy demand, which for the most part, for the next decade at least, is going to be fueled predominantly by natural gas and nuclear refined its way into the mix, they're not relenting on their emissions goals. And where I see the disconnect is there's some, not all, but enough in the energy sector that are saying, oh, like that was a fad, decarbonization, sustainability thing in the past. It's like, no. Like you have energy that is on a good day, 4% of the S&P. And then you have, if you include Amazon as a tech firm, which I do, they're not consumer discretionary. I think you have, call it 40% of the S&P saying we want power and we want decarbonization. I don't envision a scenario where carbon credits don't become legitimized to facilitate the ability to accomplish both of those things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No, I agree with that. And I look to the crypto experience to kind of validate that because crypto 3-4 years ago was kind of lost in the woods.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the sponsorship wasn't there and the regulation wasn't there. Okay. And now the minute you introduced, whether you want to, give credit to the Trump administration or not, we were moving in that direction, but they have essentially validated it. They have given it a floor. And now you're seeing organizations like public funds, like who are actually putting, and endowments who are putting 3%, 5% into crypto. Now you could sit there and say, well, why wouldn't you do that for gold? Okay. Oh, that's too speculative. Well, the crypto investment is not speculative because they immediately associate it with blockchain.
Yeah.
And I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but I think the blockchain technology is going to be an exceptionally important change agent in our financial services industry. It's also going to happen with regard to energy transmission, energy power and development and so forth. The blockchain is only at its infancy. And I think that if you had the ability to fuse together carbon credits and blockchain, that you will advance the case quite a bit because of the ability of not having too many middlemen in there, validate
Or
the
just
system.
verification, right?
Exactly.
Similar have like the digital access to, here's my credit. I immediately have all the supporting verifying documentation, legitimizing all that.
Yeah.
No, I'm so bullish on the carbon market. There's a couple things that we're working on. where we think we've cracked the code on plugging abandoned wells, minting the credit, and selling that respective credit to the wells.
Very nice.
More to come on that. In the short amount of time that we have left, your lay of the land in terms of what needs to be done in the next 5 years, right? What needs, in your opinion, to get done, or what's the top priority for us to ensure that we don't fall further behind from what China and Russia and sort of what our adversaries are trying to accomplish?
Sure. I think the first thing that we have to recognize what's important to you and what's important to your family, your life, your community, and so forth. And I think that both you and I are of the same nature, is that there is a personal responsibility and feeling, I've got to leave this world in a better way than where I found it. Okay. And so the whole idea of sustainability and being environmentally sensitive, I think, is something that we need to keep at the forefront. The problem right now is that, you become criminalized for doing that, and I think that has been too overreaching. And so that's forced people into what we would call green hushing.
Yeah.
Or deniers outright. And I think that that's unfortunate. We need to get back to the point where we can have an open dialogue, where we can honestly talk about the science, and you can debate the science and so forth. But if you don't believe that there is not a climate challenge here in our world, indeed in the United States, then go talk to your local insurance broker and see what your premiums are going to look like this year and next, because they're not looking too good.
Right.
And if there's any group that is what I would call environmentally sensitive and good at behavioral science and getting people to do things the way they need to be done, it's the insurance world, believe it or not. The reinsurance and the primary underwriters are the ones that are leading the charge. I'm sorry, but because of the climate, whether it's wildfire related or whether it's with regard to water, fracking, all kinds of instances that are creating destabilized communities, I can't insure this at the same rate. I'm just sorry.
Right.
But if you change this, and this, in terms of where you're located, what your structure looks like, these preventatives, these adaptations will give you coverage.
Right.
Okay? There's nothing that you can do in life that is important without insurance.
Yeah.
You name it. Drive a car, own a house, run a business, have people work for you. All of those things have to have a backing of insurance. And those insurance guidelines are basically telling you, here's the order of life.
Right.
And this is how we see life. Please, if you really want to do business with us and you want us to backstop you, we need you to change. And so that's the first thing, is they recognize that it's important. It's important to your family, but it's also important to the insurance industry, which really is the underbelly of our capitalistic system here. It's not state run. It's not the Chinese government. That's the way the capitalist system operates. And so I see that as an important indicator of, are we going in the right direction? And I think that looking at where insurance is today and what's happening in our climate and how we're reacting or not adapting and not changing practices, that it's only going to become more expensive. And what does that do? That creates an insurance gap in our economy. That means that when the next adversity comes along, you can't recover from it.
Right.
The city can't recover. The town can't recover. The company can't recover because it couldn't get insurance coverage, and it thought, it's never going to happen that way again. So those are things that are important. I think that we also have to encourage innovation.
Yes.
And I think this government, this administration is trying to do a pretty good job of that, but we're not here to pick winners and losers. That was the past administration. How many cylinders do you want in life? Okay. And I think that that's what they're trying to avoid.
Right.
I think what they're trying to do is on the margin to encourage growth and development, which is why he's got, a very close relationship with Elon. Elon Musk, like him or not, Doge, like it or not, I think is a direct tie for Donald Trump and that administration to what the tech bros are thinking about, and how they think they can help the economy, and how they help society be, in a better place, and how they can compete internationally in a very effective manner. And I think that's an extremely important tie-in, that we don't have a national science officer that's sitting in the Oval Office with the president kind of whispering into his ear about here's what's going down.
It's a really good point, right? Musk for a short period of time was sort of like de facto, but yeah, you're right. Like why we have everything else, rightfully so. I mean, we have health and human services, and we have, urban development, and we have all these other offices.
Sure.
You're right. We don't have a Surgeon General. We don't have.
No, I call him National Science Officer or call him National Tech Officer.
That's a really good point.
But and the fact is he's not collecting a salary. He has no axe to grind.
Right.
In fact, he's losing money.
Right.
Okay. And I think that,
Millions of dollars.
he's going at it with the right, purpose in mind. Whether or not he's correct, we'll see. But I think that that's important. We need to keep that in place.
Well, I think the other thing, just not to cut you off, but you triggered me on that. Like, he's not afraid to make a mistake. Like, this is going to take some cracked eggs, the old cliche, so to speak. But like, I get irritated when people are like, "Oh, well, we made a mistake." It's like, yeah, no shit. Like, what? No one bats 1,000. It's like, it's going to happen, but he's going to fix it.
That's an inventor.
Yeah.
That is an inventor, and success is only found through failure.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
You just don't naturally fall into success. Right. You fail and fail and fail.
Bill Gates and say,
the important thing is you
immediately created Windows. Like,
exactly. Get back up again and try again.
Yeah.
Okay? And that is, and I keep everybody I come into touch with, whether I'm coaching my hockey teams in the past or whatever, it's like, guys, you learn from failure.
Yeah.
Okay?
Embrace
it. And don't be afraid.
Yeah.
And I think that's the other thing about this administration is not afraid to be wrong. He will admit that it's wrong. It's hard some days. But I think that they learn from that and say, okay, back up the truck. Let's go in another direction.
Beautiful failure ever. It was the best failure in the history of the world.
But again, I think for us and going forward is that we can't lose touch and a degree of sensitivity of the need to continue on with environmental, priorities.
Yeah.
They have to happen because it's the only way my grandchildren are going to really enjoy the world, because I don't want it to be a hotter place. I do want them to be able to go up to the Arctic one day and see a polar bear in its natural habitat. I mean, in 20 years, they may not be polar bears because, what's going to happen to the polar cap, okay?
Mm-hmm.
The food sources, what we're dumping into the water, what goes into the food chain, how that affects, our biodiversity.
Yeah.
I want them to see the world as I saw it, not in a book.
Yeah.
In reality. And so you have to be sensitive to that, but that's where engagement with corporate America, really is important, where we need to get a sense of the pulse of the management team of how do you feel about this? How are you driving, this idea of a better world? What is it that you're putting in place? And then I don't care if it's a tiny little incremental push, but it's always going in the same direction. It's continuous. There are no giant leaps that people can make here. In some cases there may be, but very few. But it's all about incrementalism. And then, the last thing I would say is that as you look forward and say, what would I like? I'd like to be able to build in a lot more self-reliability here. We have learned over the course of the last decade that we are in a very critical state of being overly reliant for things that we feel are critical to our life.
Right.
Pharma being one, defense could be another.
Technology.
Yeah, technology, all the rare earth materials, raw materials, things of that nature. We can't find ourselves there again, and we need to work ourselves out of that pit.
Yeah. I love it, man. I wish we had 2 hours. I can't thank you enough for coming on.
For having me.
This was amazing. It just goes to show that we need part 2 in the not too distant future. So if someone wants to get a hold of Sage, it's Sage Advisory. Look them up. The website's really easy.
There's www.sageadvisory.com. I'm on LinkedIn. Sage is on LinkedIn. Easy to find.
And I can assure, I've read almost everything that you guys released. The writing is immaculate. It's very thoughtful. It's very thorough. It's very pragmatic. I would encourage everyone to check it out. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Dan. It's been a pleasure.